The cold wind of the northern forests whispered through the trees, rustling brittle branches as the last of autumn's leaves clung desperately to them. Edmere adjusted his grip on his bow, his fingers calloused from years of training in the Iron Oak camp. Beside him, Beat, a stocky young cleric with a round face and shaggy blonde hair, shifted nervously. The two had been tracking the goblins since morning, following the signs of their passage: broken twigs, the occasional smear of blood, and their unmistakable clawed footprints in the damp earth. "They're close," Edmir murmured, nocking an arrow. His sharp green eyes darted through the underbrush, searching for movement. Beat swallowed, gripping the handle of his worn wooden staff. "I hate goblins," he muttered. "Vile little beasts." Edmere gave him a sidelong glance, smirking. "Then this will be a good day for you." A rustling ahead made both of them freeze. 3 goblins came into view, scurrying through the brush with their crude weapons. Rusty knives and chipped hatchets, gripped tightly in their gnarled hands. Their yellow eyes flickered with excitement as they sniffed the air. Their prey just out of reach. Edmere wasted no time. He pulled the bowstring back, the wood creaking softly as he exhaled. The first arrow flew, striking the lead goblin clean through the throat. The creature gurgled and collapsed. The second arrow found its mark in the next goblin's chest before it had time to react. The third, realizing the sudden peril, turned to flee. But Edmere was faster. The final arrow shot through the back of its skull, and it fell face first into the dirt. Beat let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "You make that look too easy." Edmere lowered his bow, stepping forward to confirm the kills. "They were distracted," he said simply. Then his gaze shifted past the fallen goblins. A rustling deeper in the woods caught his attention. 2 women emerged from the shadows, breathing heavily. Their dresses were torn, their faces smudged with dirt. They looked at the fallen goblins, then at the 2 young men who had saved them. One of the women, with dark hair and wary eyes, held her companion's wrist tightly. "You're safe now," Edmere said, slinging his bow over his shoulder. "The goblins won't bother you any more." The women hesitated. The second woman, fair-haired and visibly shaken, looked like she wanted to speak, but the dark-haired one gave her a slight shake of the head. Beat took a step forward. "You should come back with us to Iron Oak. There's shelter, food." "No." The dark-haired woman's voice was firm. "We need to keep moving." Edmere frowned. "It's dangerous out here." More goblins could be lurking. The woman glanced at the dead creatures, then back at him. "We can handle ourselves." Something about her tone made Edmere reconsider pushing the issue. There was something unspoken between the 2 women, something they weren't willing to share. He nodded, taking a step back. "As you wish." Without another word, the women turned and disappeared into the trees. Beat sighed. "Strange. You'd think they'd be grateful." Edmere watched the forest for a long moment before responding. "Everyone's got their own troubles. Best not to pry." He knelt and retrieved his arrows, wiping the blood on the grass before tucking them back into his quiver. Then, with a silent nod to Beat, he turned back towards the path home. The goblins were dead, but something about this encounter left him uneasy. And in the north, unease was never a thing to ignore. Back at Iron Oak, Edmere barely had time to set down his bow before Sir Garin Stoneheart summoned him. The grizzled leader of the camp, broad-shouldered and stern-faced, fixed Edmere with an unrelenting stare. "You left them out there?" Garen's voice was rough with disapproval. "They didn't want to come," Edmir replied, standing firm. "I didn't ask if they wanted to come," Garen shot back. "I'm telling you to go back. Make sure they get out of the forest safely. We don't leave stragglers to goblins." The embers in the hearth cast long shadows across the stone floor, flickering against the worn face of Stoneheart. He stood with arms crossed, his voice as steady as the roots of an ancient tree. "The Oaken Code is not just words, boy. It is the marrow of who we are. So tell me, how have you followed it?" Edmir, still breathless from his journey, straightened his shoulders. His jaw was tight, his voice low but firm. "I told the truth," he said, "about the woman. I left her in the forest. I should have stayed. Should have seen her safe. But I ran. I was afraid." He swallowed hard, the weight of the admission sitting heavy in the air. "Even if it made me a coward in their eyes, I spoke true. That's honor." Stoneheart gave a slow nod. "Aye, rooted in honor, even when it cuts you open. And now?" Edmir met his gaze without flinching. "Now, I'm ready to do what I should have done. Ready to see her out of the wood safe. I'll not run again. That's bending, not breaking." Stoneheart studied him, eyes searching for weakness, for false pride. When he found none, he nodded again. "Good. But what of the last?" Edmir exhaled through his nose, his hands clenched at his sides. "I have not earned my rank. I have worn it, but I've not earned it. Not truly. Not yet." Stoneheart let silence settle between them before he spoke. "Your father was a hard man, but not a cruel one. He would have told you rank is nothing without deeds to weigh it. He lived by that." He took a step forward, his voice lowering like the wind through deep woods. "I watched your father fight, watched him bleed. And when he died, it was not in comfort, not in peace, but with a sword in his hand, protecting what was his. He did not ask men to follow. They followed because he had earned it." His eyes bore into Edmir like a smith's hammer shaping iron. "I see the man you could be, boy. But that man is not here yet. If you mean to follow the code, if you mean to stand for something, then earn your rings." He turned away, letting the weight of the words settle. "Prove it." Edmir stood in silence, jaw tight, fists clenched. He gave a single nod. "I will." And with that, he left the hall, walking toward the path he should have taken before. Edmir clenched his jaw but nodded. He turned to beat, but before he could speak, a deep voice interrupted. "I'll go with you." Hain, an older warrior, and the best tracker Edmir knew, stepped forward. His hair was streaked with silver, his eyes sharp as a hawk's. "If they're still alive, I'll find them." With no further protest, the three men set off. Hain led the way, following faint tracks through the underbrush. It wasn't long before they spotted movement ahead. 4 goblins creeping through the woods searching. Edmir and Hain acted in sync. 2 arrows loosed, 2 goblins fell. The remaining pair barely had time to react before Hain closed the distance and cut them down with his sword. A rustle in the brush drew their attention. Hidden among the trees, the 2 women huddled together. "You again," the dark-haired woman murmured. We were sent to make sure you got out safely, Edmir said. The fair-haired woman, barely more than a child, looked up with wide eyes. Beat gasped. By the light! That's Queen Aladalina. Edmir's heart pounded. The Queen and her daughter, Princess Maria. The weight of their identities settled over him. He knew what was expected. He knew what Garen would demand. Swear an oath to protect us, Aladalina said. Edmir hesitated. I won't swear an oath, he said finally. But we'll get you out of this forest. The Queen studied him, then nodded. That will do. The forest loomed around them, its bare winter branches clawing at the grey sky. The narrow road was little more than a dirt path, half frozen from the lingering cold. Their breath misted in the air as they walked, their footsteps muffled by the damp earth and fallen leaves. Queen Aldalina's cloak billowed behind her, a tattered remnant of the finery she once wore in Castle Eldoria. Even in exile, she carried herself like a queen. The usurper sits on my husband's throne, and we are cast out like common thieves, she said, voice smooth but edged with steel. He dares to call it mercy, allowing us to live. Maria, walking a step behind her mother, scoffed. Mercy? He butchered Darcy, ran her through like she was some animal. Her fingers curled into fists. And she just stood there. She wouldn't even lift a hand against him. Edmir glanced at her, his expression unreadable. Darcy are bound by oath. They don't fight kings. Maria's jaw tightened. She fought for me. She protected me my whole life, and when I needed her most. She exhaled sharply, shaking her head. He knew she wouldn't fight back. That's why he killed her first. Aldalina's gaze remained fixed ahead, but her voice dropped lower. He feared her, as all cowards fear what they cannot control. As long as Maria was under Darcy's protection, we were untouchable. Now? She turned her sharp silver gaze on Edmir. Now we are prey. Maria kicked a rock off the road, her breath coming fast. Not for long. The trees creaked in the cold wind. Edmir adjusted the sword at his hip. You need to get to safety. Aldalina inclined her head slightly. Castle Thorn. It is where we must go. The Lord there is still loyal to my husband's memory. He will shelter us. Maria smirked, though there was no humor in it. If we can get there before my uncle decides to send hunters after us. Edmir exhaled, glancing down the winding path ahead. The road was long, and every mile held danger. It won't be easy. Aldalina stepped closer, her voice like the whisper of wind through the trees. Nothing worth surviving ever is. But you are of Valeri, are you not? Maria tilted her head, watching him carefully. Or are you still busy earning your rank? Edmir's jaw clenched. He had spoken of proving himself, and here was his chance. Aldalina studied him for a moment before nodding. Then prove it. The wind howled through the skeletal trees, shaking loose a few dead leaves that swirled around the dirt path. The sky was dark, with the promise of snow. Edmir stood firm, his hand resting on the pommel of his sword, his breath slow and steady. Across from him, Hain grinned, shifting his weight from foot to foot, his own hand never far from the dagger at his belt. Away from Beat and the two women, Hain whispered to Edmir, "Let's take them to the king." "Think about it, Edmir," Hain said, his voice thick with excitement. Like a gambler convinced he held the winning hand. We take them to the king, and we are rewarded. You, me, knights of the realm, with lands of our own. He smirked. You wouldn't have to be some wandering bastard anymore. You'd be a Lord Edmir of Valeri, rightful and noble. Edmir scoffed. Rightful? There's nothing rightful about betraying them. Hain rolled his eyes. Betrayal? No. This is survival. You think running through the woods, scraping by on scraps, hiding like rats is noble? He gestured toward Aldalina and Maria, who stood a few paces back, watching. They are already lost, Edmir. They have no army, no keep, no allies. His voice lowered, coaxing. But the king is not unkind. If we bring them to him, he'll give them a place in court. A marriage, maybe. A title. They'll live. Edmir shook his head. The king slaughtered their protector. He cast them out. You think he'll show them mercy now? Hain's grin faltered, but he covered it quickly. He might, if we're the ones who deliver them. He took a step closer. Do you want to spend your life as a sellsword? A beggar knight? I don't. I want land, gold. A hall of my own. And I mean to take it. Edmir clenched his jaw. Then take it with your own deeds, not by selling people to a tyrant. Hain groaned, throwing his hands up. You and your damned honor. Honor is a fine thing for dead men, Edmir. But I plan on living? He smirked again. And living well. Edmir's voice was quiet but firm. I would rather be a beggar than a man who sold his soul. Hain narrowed his eyes. You always did think yourself better than me. Always the noble bastard, acting as if you weren't born on the wrong side of the sheets. Edmir stepped forward, closing the space between them. And you always wanted to be more than you were, grasping at titles, licking the boots of the powerful. But you'll never be one of them, Hain. They'll use you. Like a dog, they'll pat on the head before they put you down. Hain's expression twisted. And, you'd rather grovel in the dirt? Edmir's eyes were steady. I'd rather stand on my own feet. Silence stretched between them, the wind the only sound. Hain exhaled sharply, shaking his head. You're a fool, Edmir, and fools die young. The cold wind howled through the trees, rattling the bare branches like bones against the sky. Hain's smirk had vanished, replaced by something colder, more dangerous. His fingers twitched over the hilt of his sword, his stance shifting into something predatory. You should have taken the offer, Edmir, Hain said, his voice laced with bitterness. Now I'll have to bring you to the king in pieces. Edmir didn't answer. His bow was already in his hands, string drawn back, breath steady. The moment stretched thin between them, then snapped. Edmir loosed the arrow. Hain lunged. The arrow struck first, slamming into Hain's shoulder with a sickening crunch. He staggered back, snarling in pain, but he did not stop. He was on Edmir in seconds, slashing wildly. Steel flashed. Edmir twisted. The sword caught the leather of his armor, slicing clean through. A burning line of pain bloomed across his chest as the blade carved through skin. He stumbled back, breath coming sharp and fast. Hain grinned through his pain, blood dripping down his arm from the arrow buried in his shoulder. Not so noble now, are you? He taunted, raising his sword for another strike. But Edmir was already moving. His fingers found another arrow, knocked it, and loosed it in one smooth motion. The arrow hit its mark, right between Hayne's eyes. The grin froze on Hayne's face for half a breath, before his body crumpled like a marionette with its strings cut. His sword clattered uselessly to the dirt. His lifeless eyes stared up at the grey sky. Silence. Then a rustle of movement behind him. "Hold still, Ed," came Beat's voice, soft but firm. The goblin healer stepped forward, placing a hand against Edmir's chest where the wound still bled. A warm golden glow spread from his fingertips, knitting the torn flesh back together. The pain dulled, then vanished, leaving only the faintest sting. Edmir exhaled, nodding once. "Thank you." He turned, stepping toward Queen Aldelina. She watched him, her gaze unreadable. But there was steel behind her eyes. Maria stood beside her, arms crossed, watching him like a wolf, deciding if he was worth trusting. Edmir met the queen's gaze. "He wanted to bring you to the king," he said simply. "To sell you for land, titles, power." His voice tightened. "I told him no." Aldelina studied him for a long moment before nodding. "And now?" Edmir dropped to one knee, bowing his head. He pressed a fist to his chest, over the wound that had nearly cost him his life. "Now I swear myself to you, my queen." His voice was steady, unwavering. "I will see you to Castle Thorn. I will fight for you, bleed for you, until my oath is fulfilled." Aldelina stepped forward, lifting his chin with a single finger. "Then rise, Edmir of Valeri," she said, "and keep your word."